Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking with Dr. T. We will begin in just a moment. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Talking with Dr. T. I'm excited about our guest tonight, and we will get started in just a moment. Good evening, everyone. We will begin in just a moment. Thank you for joining Talking with Dr. T tonight. And for those of you that are joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to comment in the chat box if you have questions. Please share this with your family and friends. Tonight is a topic that we need to talk about more. And so I'm looking forward to talking about grief and loss, mourning, and a whole lot of other topics tonight. I see Alita on. Hi, Alita. Welcome. Glad you could join us tonight. All right, it's 8 o'clock, and so I will begin tonight. I am going to introduce our, I'm going to make my guest speaker a co-host, and I am going to introduce my speaker. I am just honored and excited and humbled to have Reverend Dr. Jamie Eaddy. She is a healer, a dreamer, a theologian, a thanatologist, a poet, a friend. She has served the congregation and community in several ways as an ordained minister, chaplain, adjunct professor, loss navigation specialist, death educator, activist, and a death doula. Regardless of the title, she is concerned with people's healing and wellness and is primarily concerned with the way people navigate loss and grief. Her work sits at the intersection of theology and thanatology, and she incorporates art, music, and movement when providing care. She supports patients, families, staff, and community members during some of life's most challenging and distressing circumstances. I'm not going to read the whole because we're going to talk about it, but I also just want to say, as a loss navigation specialist and a death doula, Dr. Eaddy Chism is uniquely gifted to journey with people as they or their loved ones approach the end of life. She works to create end-of-life plans to honor each client's full humanity, assisting them with spiritual, emotional, and practical needs. However, her work with loss does not center solely on death. She helps people navigate all kinds of loss, from loss of relationship through breakup or divorce, loss of identity or sense of self, loss of hopes and dreams, loss of a sense of normalcy, etc. As a non-anxious, non-judgmental journey woman, she helps people with meaning-making, crossing over, bereavement care, and so much more. She also mentors others to provide end-of-life care and has worked with several faith communities and community organizations to support leaders as they take a more holistic approach to death and dying and processing grief. Dr. Eaddy Chism is a 2015 Princeton University Black Theology and Leadership Institute Fellow. She received her Master's of Divinity from the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union University. And I just heard Bishop Guns, Dr. Guns, Dean Guns speaking today on mental health and weaving that in theologically. Her Doctor of Ministry degree was earned from the Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, and she is a certified trauma professional. She holds a certification in death, dying, and bereavement from the Association for Death Education and Counseling. In addition, she has completed 4 units of clinical pastoral education, CPE, 3 at the Albert Einstein Medical Center at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of Getting Naked to Get Free and is married to the Reverend Dr. Michael D. Chism. Welcome this evening, Dr. Jamie.
Good evening. You know, it's interesting when folks are reading stuff about you, you're like, please don't read it, please. It just, you know, caring about yourself feels weird.
It does, it does, it does. I said that just happened on another Bible study. She says, I'm not going to read your whole bio. I said, please don't. So I get it. So thank you. We have people that have joined us on Facebook Live. People will be watching this video after it's over. So I just want to get started. And then if people do have questions, please put them in the chat. So let's start off with our first question. Can you provide the listening audience with a definition of a loss navigation specialist and a death doula?
Yes, thank you. So death doula, the term doula has been very popular in the last couple of years, right? Everybody's been talking about death doulas. So a death doula is a non-medical professional who journeys with someone toward the end of life. They provide emotional, sort of informational, right? So resources, spiritual at times, practical assistance, sort of, you know, how can you do this? What home do you need to be in? That kind of assistance for people, helping them work through grief and meaning making, helping them think through decisions, not making decisions for them, right? So the death doula is one who just comes alongside you and your loved ones to hopefully move you toward a death with peace. I'll say that, move you toward a death with peace, as you define peace. And a loss navigation specialist, that's sort of a term that I just use for myself. And that is someone who helps people navigate the terrain of loss, and not just that someone that you love or know has died, but as I mentioned, sort of loss of identity. Who am I saying now that I am divorced, or now that my parent or my child has died? Who am I now that I'm no longer the CEO of such and such job, or I was a nurse for 40 years and now I'm not a nurse? Who am I now that part of my life is sort of gone, in a sense, right? So helping people navigate that kind of loss, helping people navigate a breakup. You know, breakups are hard, whether you are married or not. However it is, you're partnered with someone, that's a loss. And so really helping people identify loss in their lives, navigate their way through loss, helping them process their grief, and helping them see how losses can be seen as like little deaths, in a sense, right? That something has died, a dream has died, hope has died, a relationship has died, and helping people process their way through that.
I really like that. So when we talk about grief and loss, it's just not the physical loss of a person to death, but it could be a breakup, the identity, dreams, hopes, ideas, and so on. So I really appreciate that. We use the term grief. Yeah. What is grief? How do you define grief?
Yeah, so for me, grief is sort of this response to our loss, right? And it is emotional, it is somatic, right? We feel it in our bodies. It is how we feel about first of all, it's natural, right? So start with that. It's a natural response to one's perceived loss. So if I recognize something as a loss in my life, these might be the ways that I respond to that loss. And so again, internal, emotional, perhaps even spiritual, somatic, it is our response to loss in general. That's how I see grief.
I really like that. So we kind of talked about what people might experience grief and loss from,
Yeah.
but let's talk about the types of loss. So, when we were planning disenfranchised grief, generational grief, chronic, how do you define those?
Yeah, so it's so interesting. I had a conversation with someone recently, and I'm talking the situation, so I'm not naming people, but we were talking about there was a death, and they were partnered with the person who died, but the person who died had another partner as well. So this was sort of a behind closed doors kind of partnership that had gone on for years. Now that the person has died, both parties are grieving, right? So this party is grieving, but everybody knows you're my partner, right? So my grief is accepted. My grief is, society is like, yes, you are the partner, the spouse. Absolutely, you should grieve. I might be the person who wasn't acknowledged. Maybe the relationship was wrong. That's not the point. The point is I too have a loss, but my loss doesn't fit into what society says is acceptable for one to sort of acknowledge as grief, right? This is so that disenfranchised grief is where your grief does not fit into what society says is acceptable or allowed for grieving. And we know that there are a lot of people whose circumstances fit into that situation, right? So some of our incarcerated siblings, right? We don't want to accept their grief because, we don't accept them. So certainly we're not going to accept their grief. I'm thinking about, I think a good word to use there is your grief is unworthy, right? Your grief is not worthy to be acknowledged, right? So we disregard you because your grief is not worthy to be acknowledged when you're thinking about disenfranchised grief. And sort of that transgenerational grief or trauma, it is what's been sort of carried from generation to generation. We talk about epigenetics, right? That in our DNA, that there's something that is coded when our ancestors go through various traumas and grief, right? That they carry that in their body. And because they are carrying that in their body, that there are some shifts that happen, right? And we now also experience that in our bodies as well, but not just in our bodies, but we're taught to respond to life a certain kind of way, right? And so that transgenerational grief carried generation to generation. It, the environments that our ancestors were in are with us. We are still carrying the trauma and the grief of, our great grandparents. We are still living that out. So when I think about transgenerational grief or trauma, that's what I think about. And then prolonged sort of grief, which I think it might be a disorder, right? I think the DSM now has that as a sort of disorder, intense feeling of longing, of yearning for the deceased, right? For the person that is no longer here with us physically, perhaps even preoccupied, right? Unable to concentrate. Now we know being unable to concentrate is something that happens in general with the loss, right? That there is a period, and we might talk about sort of stages or phases or ways we process our grief, right? So we know that lack of concentration can be something that all of us experience when we're dealing with the loss. But after a period of time, someone who is still sort of navigating that lack of concentration, that the preoccupied with thoughts of the deceased, that's when I guess doctors, psychologists, therapists begin to say, hey, we might need to think about this a bit, right? Maybe you haven't been able to integrate the loss into your life, right? So you're still stuck here on Wednesday and Sunday's already come. And so that's what I think about with sort of chronic or prolonged kind of grief.
Absolutely. It's interesting because the show of Talking with Dr. T T is bridging the gap between faith and mental health. And as you were talking about disenfranchised grief, as you were talking about generational trauma and talking about prolonged or chronic grief, it is really important for people to understand that there are feelings and emotions that can impact your mental health. And this is normal reactions to these extraordinary events. And it's really important. We all have mental health, and there can be things that trigger our challenges in our mental health. But again, I want to help to normalize these feelings and emotions to these extraordinary events. Yeah, and I really heard that as you were talking, especially with the generational trauma. You know, when we talk about trauma, there's a book that's called The Body Keeps Score. The body holds on to that trauma, and so then that can manifest into physical ailments. And so I really appreciate you describing that, and I want our audience to understand that these are normal reactions.
Normal.
Right. So let's talk about these normal reactions. And you talked about society and some of the stigmas on society. I just, where do these stigmas on the timeline of grief come from? And is there a timeline on grief?
Right. So first of all, a girlfriend of mine asked me what grief looks like and how long should we grieve? And I said, grief looks like you, right? So it is my grief. And so I'm going to process it a certain way. And all of us, there's sort of this universal kind of response, but each of us has an individual response to our grief. And it looks different from person to person. And so this idea of a timeline, I think it comes from a couple of areas, a couple of places. One, I think society is concerned about our production. And so to actually pause, to acknowledge and to sit in and to feel your grief disrupts production. Like, just plain and simple, I think it disrupts production. And so how can we continue with production? What we do is we help people disconnect from their emotions, right? So if I can get you disconnected from your feeling and pressing through when maybe you should pause, then I can continue producing whatever it is and I desire to produce. So I think part of it is that. The other part of it is in faith communities. Please don't tell me it's not your church. I get it. It is not everybody's church, right? I understand it. In some faith communities, we are preoccupied with sort of victory. We are preoccupied with happiness. And so in order to move to happy, right? In order to move to victory, I can't sit in my grief too long. And so I think part of it is we've been socialized in our faith communities to say, okay, mama died on Monday. It's 3 Mondays since then. I need you, come on, praise the Lord. You have the victory. God is good, right? And while I do believe we have the victory, I do believe God is good, I also know that God has created us with emotions, right? Like, that is part of our humanity. And so I think that in many ways, faith community or church or religion or whatever term you want to use has taught us in ways to disconnect from emotion. Emotion is not spiritual, right? So to disconnect from emotion and again, couple that with society's desire for us to be productive at all costs, I think that's the recipe we have.
Absolutely. I really appreciate this. I was just talking about, we all have soul, right? And soul is our emotions, intense emotions.
Yeah.
And when we disconnect from our emotions, we're disconnecting for who we are in humanity, right? Yeah. And you know, we'll get to the different theories of grief and loss and mourning, but part of going through the grief and loss process and mourning is allowing yourself to feel and experience the emotions and the pain, right? Yes. What gets in the way? The production, I get that. Why do you think people do not want to experience the pain of emotions of grief and loss?
Right. And Doc, I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna back up just a little bit. So I think production gets in the way, but I also think that our ancestors had to protect in a certain kind of way, right? Yes. The idea was to stay alive.
Yes.
And so staying alive may have meant not showing weakness, not crying, not being overly emotional because you don't want to scare the good folk and lest they think you're a threat, right? So I think in some ways it is production, but it was also, I want to keep my babies safe. And so don't you dare be out there crying so people take advantage of you, right? And so it was, the intention was safety. But what happens is the intention doesn't equal the impact, because the impact is I learned to disconnect from, I can't be emotional. I can't connect to my emotions, although the intention was to keep me safe, right? So I think that's also part of it. So I just needed to say that piece in there.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was teaching a class this semester, and we were talking about the emotions and the grief and what's been passed down. Our ancestors have protected us, and it's a safety issue. So now we have people in later generations. I'm not supposed to show emotion.
Right.
It's just regular. I just keep on moving on. And so we have to change that, because it is part of our humanity. It is part of our soul. And really, I come from this perspective, just like Jesus Christ died on the cross for us to live. What patterns of behavior must die in your life for you to live? Because if you're not allowing yourself to live and feel those pains and emotions from the grief, you're holding yourself back.
Yeah. Doc, I'm gonna say something real personal. So I wrote Getting Naked to Get Free. And it's mostly about my personal life, mostly. It's creative, right? Because it's poetry, so it's creative. But there's a piece in there called Sleep Without Sleeping. And it talks about, I was going to separate myself, but my therapist said, stop doing that, right? Back in the day, I was like, it talks about a young girl. No, it talks about me.
Yes.
And it was my response to early childhood sexual abuse, right? And sort of disconnecting and carrying grief and disliking and not knowing, this is pain, this is grief, but not knowing how to talk about it, right? Because I had to be strong, didn't tell anybody the story. And in the poem, I reach maybe age 35, 36. And it's like a crisis, like it's a moment, come to Jesus moment. And I had to go back to all of these little stops along the way. I had to go and talk to 6-year-old Jamie and 13-year-old Jamie, and really every age, but in the poem, I speak specifically about certain ages because I had a loss. I had a loss at 6. And then I had these other losses where I disconnected from myself, right? No, not unlike many of my siblings in the world, right? And I had to go back and grieve. And going back to grieve meant I had to go tell the 6-year-old, like, it wasn't your fault. Let's feel that. So that's what that poem is about. And you say, like, yeah, so some of this is stuff that we've carried, and learning what we need to kill or what needs to die in our own lives so that we can live. That's what a loss navigation specialist also does. It helps you figure out what you need to lose in order to live. So some of it is you've lost this or stuff, you process it. But some of it is, listen, that ideology that you've been carrying, yeah, maybe you needed that for protection at 15, but at 45, you don't need that same kind of protection today. So let's let that go. Yes, absolutely.
I love how you're saying that. And for me as a clinician, I come from this perspective that early development impacts later development. So what happens early in life can have an effect on later development, but we as a people can be resilient. So here it is, I'm listening to you and you were resilient at 15, but I think about grief like layers of an onion. You have each layer represents some aspect of loss, right? You can be resilient, but later in life, something triggers all of that to come to the surface. And so sometimes the immediate reason why you're dealing with grief, all of this stuff from the past comes up. And so I truly believe in order for you to live, you may have to finish some unfinished business.
Yes. I went back out, and I can tell you, like, literally, I can tell you the day and the time that moment of going back and sort of writing the poem. And it was in writing the poem that I was going back. And I know the day and the time that took place in my life, right? Because that was when Jamie lived differently.
Yes.
Right. That was sure. Yeah, I accepted Christ. Okay. Right. For those who are Christian, sure. I got saved, eternal salvation. Yeah. But at 37, because the poem says 36, but technically it was like 4 days after my 36th birthday. So at 37, I went back and visited all of these Jamies to take care of some unfinished business and to let myself grieve and go through the process. And I lived differently. Now I'll say this, going back, there were still some behaviors that I had learned and had come accustomed to that now I had to unlearn. So I had to replace some things, and that takes work, right? Yes. Grief also, healing takes work. So then I had to do some work, but the going back was absolutely necessary for my living whole and healthy.
Yeah. You know, I have to get your book, by the way. So before we end, we're going to tell the listening audience how we can get your book, because your book sounds very similar to my book with the 4 quarters. And we have a duty to ourselves to be able to go back and write our stories and finish the unfinished business to fully live, because I believe the first half of our life is designed for us to develop skills and coping strategies and managing to live life in our second half of life.
Yeah. Oh, this is so good.
Yeah, it is. And so here it is, we're talking about life. And you know, when I was getting these questions ready for our discussion, I had no thoughts about what was going to happen in Buffalo. And here it is, we have a crisis in Buffalo. It can trigger, again, we talk about that trauma, the grief and loss, Black Lives Matters, death and grief. So I want to go back. Let's talk about grief from a cultural perspective.
First of all, you talked about some of these individual griefs that we have, right? So these losses that we have, personal losses that I can name in my own life, there's grief associated with that. I also, as a Black woman, am carrying the grief of my mother or trauma, my mother, my great, I'm carrying some stuff of my ancestors. I look around and see what's happening in the world around me. While I don't necessarily know specifically who these people are, they still have bodies that look like mine. And so just the idea of Black bodies being treated in this way, there's some pain and grief that I'm carrying as a result of that. And for me, if you look at Black and brown bodies, that this is what happens to the grief, right? Because we don't get a moment to process, right? We talked about production. We talked about sort of society, capitalism, or society's need for you to be productive. We talked about faith communities needing you to be victorious, right? And we talked about sort of a disconnection from our emotions and not knowing how to, I was protected. So you got all this going on, which means that every time there's a loss in my life, I'm not processing, this is what's happening. So if you think about it in layers of clothing, every time I'm just throwing on another coat, another coat, another coat. And I never get a chance to sit down and take off the coat and look at it and say, wow, whew, that was heavy, that hurt. Like, we don't get that chance to do that because there's continuous loss that we have to deal with. And so one, finding a space for community to process grief is crucial. Faith communities, but not just faith communities, like community, we need to set up some sacred and safe spaces for people to process grief. But if you think about, they talk about sort of phases or stages of grief. I read an article once that talked a little bit differently about the phases of grief. And this is kind of where I sat there. And it said, so for Black grief, despair, self-blame, a move to action, you got stuff to do, right? Endurance, because you got to press your way through, and survival. They said that's how we grieve. So we don't necessarily get to do these other things because we go from despair to survival mode. Never, and there's a difference between sort of surviving and thriving, right? Survival mode is hard on the body. right? Survival mode. We are not created to live in survival mode.
Right.
However, that is what sort of people of the African diaspora, other Black and other brown bodies, other marginalized communities, they are living in survival.
Yes.
The body doesn't even heal properly when you are living in survival, right? We have to figure out a way to pause so that we can heal and thrive. But when I think about sort of Black grief, or and I wrote this article once that talked, because death doulas is so hot right now. It's what everybody want to be a death doula. I work for an organization that trains death doulas, and I get it on one hand, but another hand, it's like, yo, don't just do this so you can make money, right? But the one thing that I press in these classes is, and this is serious. The overwhelming majority of folks who call themselves death doulas are white women. The overwhelming majority. And I say, if you are not concerned about the healthy, whole living of Black bodies, then you can't really be concerned during their death, right? If their life is not important to you as a doula,
Yes.
then certainly you don't need to be present at their death, right? And so this whole death doula movement for me is, I need you to care about people's living so that you can, because you need to be there for the living. They need to live so that they can have a certain kind of death. Because what happens in people's death is all of that grief and trauma that they've carried is still present.
Absolutely.
And it impacts how they say goodbye in the world.
Yes.
So yeah, when I think about sort of Black grief, I do think in terms of despair and self-blame, and then this rush to survival, because that's where we got to be. We got to live in survival mode.
Absolutely. Survival mode, you talk about the layers and the layers and the layers of grief. And as Black and brown people, and all people, but I'm specifically talking about Black and brown, we have high blood pressure in our community. We have high cholesterol. We have heart disease, right? We have gastrointestinal issues. We have anxiety and depression. Those layers keep impacting the body. Survival mode. Now you're leaning over and wondering why your body aches. You're having headaches. So I really want our listeners to understand that there is a relationship with grief and collective grief and physical health and mental health. And so when you're working through grief, it is important to pay attention to your physical health. It is important to pay attention to your mental health as well. So I just had to put that out there, because I think people think grief is just an emotion. You talk about stages, and I don't have to deal with the other aspects, but it all goes hand in hand.
Yeah, it is felt in the body. There's sometimes when I teach a class, I ask people how they're feeling, right? Like how you're feeling. And folks tell me, if it's a faith community, they say things like, I'm blessed, right? And I tell them, blessed is actually not a feeling, right? So I want you to tell me how you're feeling.
Right.
Are you sad? Are you numb? Are you angry? Like, let's talk about feelings. And then I say, how does your body feel?
Yes.
Right? Like, how does your body feel? And sometimes they'll talk about like pain in the neck and in the shoulders. And we talk about whether or not, we said you slept wrong, right? You slept wrong and you get this pain. Right. I said, but what if it wasn't that you slept wrong and it is grief and trauma sitting in your body?
Yes.
Right? What if that pain that you had in your back for months is grief and trauma? What if that's a somatic response to the loss that you've had? Because our bodies do respond. You said the body keeps score. Our bodies respond. Yes. And so, as you said, it's not just the mental, the emotional, the spiritual health. It is what is happening in your body.
Yes.
That headache, you had a headache for 3 weeks. Let's talk about that. Right? Let's talk about what that could be. So in the body, it's important for us to take care of the body.
Absolutely. So we talk about this grief, whether it's individual grief, collective grief. Let's talk a little bit about stages, theories, processes of grief. And I'll just say, when I'm working with people, I help them to understand Kubler-Ross's, and I look at it as a process. People go through some of the stages, not all of them. It's not in sequential order, but I also talk about Warden's task of mourning and going through the pain and emotions and re-identifying who you are as a person, your relation. But I want to hear from you, and I want our audience to hear from you about your theories and process of grief and loss.
Yeah, so it takes wardens, right? Which I really do appreciate that, right? So accepting the reality, dealing with the processing the pain, adjusting, right? So for me, realization, right? That's what's happening there. And when I'm doing sort of workshops or lectures, we talk about this period of reflection, which is the realization, which is the naming, right? Because I don't know that we can process without naming.
Yes.
And so often we are silenced. And so to actually just set up a space for people to name out loud with someone who values what they say.
Yes.
Right? So we go through, when I'm working with folks, we go through this period which we call reflection. Reflection is naming the loss. It is an acknowledgement. Or if you think about wardens, right? It is realization. It is realization. We talk about feelings, reconnecting to feelings, because we disconnect. We disconnect from emotion. And it is imperative that we work against that. Right? Because that's how change comes, because we've been socialized to disconnect. It takes work to work against disconnecting. And so, what does it mean to feel?
Yes.
What does it mean to feel? And I have my little sitting over there, my little feelings wheel, right? Which you give to people, but I tell them, take it to the refrigerator, right? Helping people acknowledge their emotions. So it is the reflecting, the naming, it is the reconnecting, the processing, it is the realizing what's happening somatically, what's happening in our bodies, because grief hits our bodies as well. And so we go through it. For me, we go through a period of acknowledging literally every part of our body. What's happening in my mind, in my head? How do I feel here? How do I feel in my shoulders? We go through the entire process of acknowledging the body. And for me, that part is processing the pain as well, because it's not just the emotional pain, but it is how pain sits in our bodies. I call it reconnecting with ancestor, right? Because he talks about, Warden talks about sort of these continuing bonds. How do you maintain a bond, right? Just because you had the loss, for us, doesn't mean that the loss is I don't want to say permanent, but we still remain connected to those that we lost. And so figuring out a way to integrate them into our lives, for me, is part of that process of grieving, healthy grief. That process that I talked about, going back, sort of rewinding and going back to the spaces that were broken, wherever there's a loss in my life, if I have not processed these other losses well, it's necessary to go back and take off some of these layers. So that rewinding specifically allows me to go back and sort of rediscover me when I had these other losses. That's part of the process for me when we're talking about what it looks like for you to move through grief in a healthy way. These are some of the things that are necessary to move through grief in a healthy way. And I know we have all kinds of language to describe these kinds of things. And there's a part for me about ritual. Ritual is important in our grieving. Now, let's think about what COVID did. When COVID hit, I was serving at the Albert Einstein Medical Center as a chaplain. And some of the most challenging days of my life in terms of providing spiritual care for a community, because I had to tell families that I knew were grieving that they could not come into the hospital when Big Mama won't be here after today. Like, to have to tell somebody that they can't come in. Because in the beginning, nobody could come in. Eventually, hospitals let 1 or 2 people in, but they couldn't go into the room. They had to stand outside the room. But we had to get to that point. Because at first they were like, we don't know what this thing is. So nobody can come in the hospital.
Right.
Watching people through. So that's a whole nother kind of grief that we will have to process. But ritual is important. People have traditional ways of honoring their dead.
Yes.
And so for some, it is a funeral, right? But it is also everything that leads up to the funeral.
Yes.
So I let everybody know Big Mama died. People come to the house and they hug me and they bring me plates, right? They bring me pots of food and things, right? And then we work on the obituary together. People get pictures, but it's often something that's not done in isolation, often.
Yes.
Then we move to the if you have a pastor or a faith leader, they've probably had conversation with you. They've been there. They've been present, right? Then you move into this, here is the funeral time. Everybody gathers and they let you cry and mourn, and you see community surrounding you, right? And that funeral, then if the interment and a repast.
Yes.
And at that repast or the funeral, whichever way you want to look at it, that's a line of demarcation.
Right.
That is, while you will still grieve after the funeral, right? There's still going to be you'll still be processing your grief. That marker says this period of my life has ended and it's time for me to move into this next stage of my life. It is a clear line of delineation. It is a marker for us. And often that marker is helpful in me moving forward.
Yes.
What COVID did was it removed the marker.
Mm-hmm.
Not only did it remove the marker, it removed all of these other processes that occur before the marker.
Yeah.
And so people had a death and no ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Ritual is important to us,
Yes.
right? Ritual is a marker. It
Yeah.
tells us something. And so helping people with ritual when they are grieving, helping them create, identify, live out a ritual, even after the death. So today we're hosting memorials on Zoom if necessary. I want everybody to bring their picture of the person and or people who are no longer with them. And we go through, I want you to tell me something about, like, we need a ritual.
Right.
So that people can process.
Yes.
So for me, all of those things help us in the processing. So they fit into Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages, if you will. They fit into that. They fit into Warden's tasks of grief and mourning. They fit into like Rondo's 6R. They fit all into all of those things. But they take into account, for me, Black history. They take into account that you are also carrying this intergenerational trauma and grief as well. And so all of those things, but let's not forget that it's not just that your cousin died, it's that your cousin died at the hand, say at the hands of police, and you can go back to having great grandparents lynched at the hand. So it is that kind of space that's created for me, that we don't just discuss you today, we discuss all of you, because you were your grandfather as well. And so that's brought into the processing, not forgetting that we are not islands, but we are connected to our ancestors, to our families who are present, and even to those who will come after us. That's why it's important that we process and get some of this stuff right.
Absolutely. I love it, because what you're really talking about is really understanding the cultural influences of grief and understanding culture. So if I were to take our language from counseling, really being a multicultural, competent grief doula or life navigation specialist, because you have to understand the culture to help navigate through the stages and help navigate through the task of mourning, right? So I really appreciate that. I'm going to go back because we talked about acceptance. That's the first task of Warden, accepting the reality of the loss. Kubler-Ross says acceptance. Let's help people to understand, what does that really mean? Because I often hear people say, what? You want me to accept that I lost this person or I lost this relationship? but let's help them understand what is acceptance.
Yeah, because when I hear folks talk about acceptance, they think it means that they're okay with it.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Like, oh, I'm good, that is over. Like, I accept it. Yeah, I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's this acknowledgement that this is my reality, that who was here with me yesterday is not here, that my life has shifted, and that there is a new way of being for me because of I'm different. I am different as a result of this loss. So for me, acceptance is, it's not that you're happy that your aunt died. It's not that you are happy that, whether it was a old age or violent, traumatic, sudden kind of death. It does not mean that we are happy, like, hey, we are okay with everything that's happening. What we are accepting is that this person is no longer with us in this form, and that I am still here.
Right.
And now I have to find a way to move forward in my life, right? And so acceptance it's really just sitting everything on the table and saying, this is the life I have now.
Right.
This is where I am now.
Right.
And knowing that, having that knowing, like, in here, this is where I am now, is how I help people look at acceptance. Not that you're happy. I'm not happy that the loss is there.
Right.
This is where I am now.
This is where I am now. And where I am now is different than where I was before the loss.
Yeah.
And who I am now is different. And I still don't know who I am. And that's going to take time to redefine who I am as a result of this loss.
Yes. Redefining ourselves. So for me, that is also part of the process, right? Redefining, or rediscovering, reimagining who I am and who I can be. And part of that for me is that integration of who the person was into what do I carry forward with me? Like, my grandmother was an amazing cook, and I have her recipes. I'm not happy that my grandmother only lived to be 67, right? She's been dead for 25 years. I'm not happy that my grandmother only lived to be 67. But she lives in me through the gift of hospitality. She lives in me in my ability to go in the kitchen and bake some stuff from scratch. She lives in me in the way that I open my doors to those who are in need, because she didn't lock her door. In Germantown and Philadelphia, Grandma, lock the door. No, people might need something. They're gonna come by, and she lives in me, and I'm still connected to her because of her influence in my life, right?
Yeah. This is so good. We could go on and on and on. We got 15 minutes left, but I want, let's go back to COVID. And you and I had talked early on in COVID, and you getting so many calls from churches and pastors and faith leaders. So let's really talk about the role of the church. So first, what did you notice with pastors and churches and clergy during COVID? And why is talking about grief and loss and mourning important for churches and clergy?
Yeah. First thing I noticed was that so many congregations had never even used the word grief, right? It was not part of their vocabulary.
Yeah.
And so it was just completely uncharted territory for many people, right? Mm-hmm. So that was one thing. The second thing I noticed was that it took COVID for some faith leaders to realize that they needed help. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That while you might be gifted, you as the pastor you have a certain role. I understand that. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it took COVID for some pastors to say, I might need to connect y'all with a therapist or a grief coach or counselor or something. Like, it took COVID to get us there. But I also realized that pastors were feeling the loss, but were still trying to be superhuman in the beginning. Mm-hmm. Which gives a bad impression on what it looks like to grieve, right? Because we were all going through some mess. Right. So to not show that, to not show your humanity, it took being worn down for some faith leaders to actually just show, to be human, yes. Right? And so I noticed that. But then I noticed that folks were asking for help. Folks wanted you to be present, and they opened their spaces. It's, at least to me, they opened their spaces, and they would want everything from like, tell us what grief is, like give us grief 101, right?
Right.
And so for many churches, we would do 3 or 4 sessions, some more, but 3 or 4 sessions on sort of talking about normalizing grief, giving people space to feel and name, how, you know, tips on how to integrate loss into your life, and memorial services. Like that was my life in 2020 for many churches. But I found that some faith leaders now understand the importance of relationships and connection with therapists, chaplains, social workers, right? They now understand that you can have, you know, Christ and a counselor, right? That theology and therapy can go together. Like I think many more faith spaces are opening up to, you know, it's not the devil that you are depressed. Right. Maybe that ain't the devil. Maybe that ain't Satan. Right. Maybe it is grief or loss, or even other mental health. Like they start to understand that they start to understand their own. Some realize that what they were dealing with. And so, I noticed that we, at least in a lot of spaces I was in, folks are now open to inviting in and understanding the whole being, which is your spiritual health, your mental and emotional, your physical, but that mental health, that's also part of their overall, they are trying to shift the culture of their church so that mental health becomes as important as our whole health, right? Spiritual, emotional, physical health. They are looking at mental and emotional health as important.
Yeah, and I love that. And I agree with you. For some, I think it took COVID for that to happen. And we still have work to do, but more people are now making the connection. So what tips and suggestions might you have for clergy, for churches, seminaries, as they weave in this theology of grief and loss and mourning into their ministering and pastoring and training?
First of all, do it. So in seminaries, you absolutely must have courses that look at grief loss, that death, bereavement, grief loss, right? You must create courses that allow seminarians to look at the practical work, right? So not just theory, yes, but also praxis, how they can engage in community, because that's not necessarily something that we did before. Dr. McMickle, the former president of the Colgate-Rochester Crozer Divinity School, he encourages me all the time. He's like, Jamie, nobody talked about thanatology when I was in school. This death, dying, grief, and bereavement, nobody talked about that when I was in school. But if we can talk about it today. So finding a way to introduce those courses and making it a part of your pastoral care, like it's a necessity. You have to take certain courses in order to move through the program. For pastors, ensuring that your associate ministers, your associate pastors have training, right? And so whether that is encouraging people to get at least 1 unit of CPE, if they're in ministry, right? At least 1 unit of CPE. It's different if you've gone to school and you have you're a licensed professional counselor, you're a social worker, that, okay, maybe you don't need a unit of CPE, but I'm talking about others. At least a unit of CPE to make sure that whether it's quarterly, yearly, that you engage in we do leadership development, right? In our churches for our leaders. Well, this is also part of we need to do this sort of spiritual care development kind of thing in our churches. How do we help our leaders, associate ministers, deacons as well? How do we help them navigate this space? So how do we help deacons and ministers visit those who are in a hospital, right? I tell people as a chaplain, most of my time wasn't spent praying. It was
Right.
spent listening. So helping, like, what do we do? Can we train our leaders? Yes, pastors, have someone come in. You don't have to do it. There are people who are qualified to do this. And then I would encourage, or some tips is, know who the therapists are in your congregation, but also in your community, and set up space for them to help you. Right, you can do partnerships. You can give them office space in your building, and because of their office space, here's 20% off for congregants. Right, but there are ways that we can look at the text, and let's acknowledge some of the grief and the loss in the text. Right.
Yes.
So can you preach a sermon and actually lift up the points of the emotional health points that are in the text, right? Not just can we lift up some of the emotional and the mental health nuggets that are in the text?
Yes.
Ensuring that as a pastor, that from the pulpit, that my language it addresses grief and normalizes grief and loss, and those who are dealing with grief and loss. Also, those who, we all have mental health. Sometimes it's stressed, sometimes it's level, right? Being able to have language that does not shame. Don't shame me because I'm depressed. Don't shame me because I deal with anxiety. So that's a pastor's role, to shift the culture in their congregation. So for me, figuring out ways to introduce these concepts through your preaching and your teaching. Those are just some of the things. And then, like, bringing people in. Pastor Maria Crumpton, Elmwood United Presbyterian Church in East Orange, New Jersey. I'm going to be with them 3 Wednesdays in June. It's like being able to say, listen, my church needs to have this conversation, and you get in with the people. Come on and get in with the people. Just asking folks to come in and help you. And one thing I would say, since congregations are returning to their spaces, one, we will never get back to where we were. So a tip is, let's understand our language when we're telling people to come into the building. We're not going to be able to go back to where we were, right? So knowing that, but also you've had people who have had so many losses over the past couple of years, and maybe they did have a funeral, but maybe not. Is there something that the congregation can do collectively? Set up a memorial service. I tell people, let's bring in pictures that day. Let's write down names on cards and leave them at the altar, right? Let's incorporate the process into the community, so that we can all sort of collectively, we can have our line of demarcation together that says, yes, we've suffered losses and we can still live and thrive. So I think those are some of the things that we can do at every level: universities, churches, communities. Those are things we can do together.
I love it. And here's the thing, what I'm hearing, we are designed to be in relationship. Pastors and churches, you don't have to do it all alone. There are people in the body of Christ that you can call on, and we can save lives together. I love it. Yeah. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And as we come to an end, I just want to ask my infamous question: is there anything else you would like to say that we haven't talked about?
Yes, one thing.
Okay.
You can thrive. That your loss does not define you. And that there is someone, right? There is someone who is opening a space for you, if you're dealing with loss, where you can be fully yourself, fully human, and process in a space that is non-judgmental and loving and full of compassion. And if you can't identify that space, go to thoughtfultransitions.org and let me know, and I will help you create a space that you can do just that.
And I love it. So give people how they can contact you. So the website for
Yeah.
Thoughtful Transitions and
Yes.
Facebook page, and
Yep.
how I and other people can get your book.
Yes. So thoughtfultransitions.org. If you type in thoughtful transitions, I think you'll get me, thoughtfultransitions.org. Facebook is Jamie Eaddy, but also Jamie Eaddy Thoughtful Transitions. You can find Thoughtful Transitions at Lost Navigator on Instagram and Twitter. But if you go to the website will send you to all of the socials as well. And if you just look me up, Jamie Eaddy, on Facebook, I can help you get to the socials too. And Getting Naked to Get Free is a collection of poetry, and you can get that on Amazon and probably, like, you know, Barnes and Nobles and other other places like that. But certainly you can get it on Amazon. Getting Naked to Get Free. It's in Kindle version as well. And it is really a very vulnerable, open collection of poetry that deals with loss and pain and trauma and healing. Is messy. It is what life is. And ultimately, though, I walk away knowing that I am still becoming whole. And so I invite you to get that, and let's have some conversation around some of the pieces too, right? Let's talk about it.
I love it. So you can thrive.
Yes.
Wilt thou be whole? You can be whole.
Yes.
Right? I love it. That's wonderful. You know, I thank you so much. And I have to go back because our mutual friend, Danielle,
Yes.
she has been talking for years and years for you and I to connect. And
Yes.
then we met during the pandemic. And I still believe God has more for us to do and work
Yes.
together to do. So I thank you for
Yes.
just being a
Thank you.
part of my life. I love you. I love the work that you're doing. So continue blessings to you. And my prayers that God continues to watch over you and place you in those contexts where people need you. So thank you so much, Dr. Jamie.
Thank you, Dr. T. I appreciate you. I see you as, you don't know this, but I see you as mentor. I watch you, I listen, and you even have me thinking more about education. And I know all it, but you got me thinking about even continuing so I can continue to become what the community needs for healing. So thank you so much. I've loved our conversation tonight.
Absolutely. And as scripture says, as iron sharpens iron, so do two people sharpen each other. So I thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining the show tonight, talking with Dr. T. Thank you for those that are watching after the fact. Please join me next month. I am so excited about my guest in June, Reverend Dr. Irving Fryer, former professional football player, pastor at a church in New Jersey. And we're going to talk about bridging the gap between faith and mental health, sports, family, and it's just going to be a powerful conversation. So join us the third Tuesday of June, and then we'll be taking a break for the summer and starting back up in the fall. Thank you all for joining us. God bless you, and have a wonderful, phenomenal remainder of the week. Good night.